As it was announced, our guest tonight is Vitaliy Yarema, former General Prosecutor of Ukraine, former First Deputy Prime Minister, former People's Deputy. Greetings to you, Vitaliy Grigorovich. Good evening. Good to see you. Let's talk about achievements of a current Attorney General, Cyprus companies, and etc. If you would have a chance to make a rating of the Attorney General of Ukraine of all times, who would you pick? First of all, I don't have a moral right to do such thing. Secondly, based on what criteria would you like for me to do so? Well, you are the professional, right? Current Attorney General doesn't even have the legal education. The law itself had to be changed in order to put him in this position. So how would you evaluate his work, even though he is not educated to be in this position? Was his work successful throughout this year? First of all, I would like to announce this fact. There is no such thing as Attorney General's report to the Parliament or anybody else. Attorney General activities are strictly regulated by the Constitution, the law on the procuracy, and the criminal procedure law. These are the three main documents, and none of them state anything like Attorney General's report, simply because Attorney General's report is more of the political issue, which shouldn't get involved into the procedure activity moreover. However, if Yuri Vitalyevich agreed to inform the Parliament on the state of the law in the country, this is his personal decision. I do understand and support him on this. As for the evaluation of the results of his work, I am not quite ready to do so from the position of a former Attorney General. But there were many of the good developments in 2014, starting with absentia conviction adapted by the Rada through our initiative, the law on the procuracy, establishment of the military procuracy, which is working quite successfully, and today is one of the most effective investigating units. These are being implemented now, maybe not as quickly as anyone wants. But we are talking, however, about some realistic results, and the society needs to react rightfully and adequately. As for the shortcomings in his work, it has been and always will be there. As for his personal responsibility as Attorney General, his statutory functions are described by the law and the criminal procedure law. As for the success rate of the crime detection, it's more of a question for the investigation and the procedure heads, department heads, as Attorney General doesn't always have the ability to directly influence the investigation of the case. I cannot evaluate and make a rating simply because it's rather unethical. Secondly, I do think that Mr. Lutsenko does everything in his power to bring the order in our country. Coming back to Svetlana and her question, you have come to the General Procuracy from the Ministry of Internal Affairs structure. Yuri Vitalyevich have also led Ministry of Internal Affairs a while back, but without a proper high-level education. What do you think? How important is the educational part, especially when we talk concerning Attorney General? I do think this is important, as Attorney General is a procedural persona, in fact the supreme procedural persona, which has the higher procedural rights, and he must be, first of all, a lawyer by education. The political decision made by the Rada to put Yuri Vitalyevich in this position is strictly responsibility of the Rada. And how much of this, of any influence to his work, was clearly described today by himself. During his address, Mr. Lutsenko expressed his regrets that he doesn't have a proper legal education and how much it does interfere him in his work. But when you are facing issues of procedural matters, in particular submissions to the Rada on issues of criminal liability of people's deputies, and the election of preventive measures, evaluation of work, Article 36 and 37 of the Criminal Procedural Code, evaluating of the prosecutors of the lower ranks, appropriate personnel decisions are obviously the very responsible issues that do require proper education. Mr. Yarema, based on how many funds the prosecutor's office, led by Mr. Lutsenko, was able to return back to the budget of the country, please tell us why during your service as general prosecutor, the prosecutor's office hasn't been as successful. There weren't any special difficulties. We all work under the same conditions. The only difference was that in 2014 there were still barricades on the streets. The society was demanding immediate disclosure of Maidan's crimes and liability of Yanukovych and his surrounding. And it was then when Russian Federation aggression against Crimea and eastern Ukraine has begun. And it wasn't, by the way, only Donetsk region, but let me remind you of Zaporizhia, Nikolaev, Kherson, and Odessa's so-called People's Republic. We have immediately initiated to establish military prosecutor's office in cooperation with SBU, which enabled us to detain all of those dangerous groups and to take appropriate procedural decisions. But in my opinion, the activity of general prosecutor couldn't be measured by the fact of how much money have been returned back to the budget of the country. And generally, according to the Constitution, the main responsibilities of the general prosecutors are the supervision of compliance of the law, the representation of the state, as well as representing prosecution and the court. These are his constitutional functions, and there is nothing in it upon the return of the money back to the budget. In 2014, if you can remember, there were many of the law enforcement activities daily, and let me remind you what was going on with the prosecutor's office of those days. How local pricelings have placed themselves above the law and started to beat regional prosecutors, breaking into their offices, and etc. For example, in Dnipropetrovsk region. This was a very difficult state for us, especially when the society considered those pricelings as national heroes. And to resist it, to comply with the law, to investigate all of those cases, it was quite difficult. It was the main reason behind my resignation, followed by my personal application. Comparing to Yuri Vitalyevich Lutsenko, I haven't had any political support, as well as society's loyalty to understand why the general prosecutor office doesn't do populistic actions and rather stand firm on complying with the law. Yes, it is true. I wasn't trying to be popular and I haven't tried to market the prosecutor's office. However, my last report to the Rada in February of 2015, which happened, by the way, on the same day I've signed my resignation letter, talks about my main idea, which was pretty clear. The current government, which came in power on the blood of Maidan's victims, shall be liable to 10 times more than Yanukovych's government. I was able to bring proof of the crimes committed by that government, that cabinet of ministers, and we are talking here over 200 cases, including monopolies, such as Energoatom, Ukr, Energocenter, Energo, Ukr, Nafta theft. All those cases were filed. If any of you journalists want to investigate where are those cases now, they can. However, under my leadership, all those cases were actively investigated. Thank you. Okay, thank you, Mr. Goncharenko, for taking part in our live program. According to Mr. Yarema, political support is the main thing, and the current general prosecutor has it all. Do you agree, Mr. Goncharenko? Well, my support of Mr. Lutsenko goes as far as his ability to keep on bringing money back to the budget of the country. I want to underline this once again. On every invested hryvnia into the General Prosecutor's office, we are getting 10 back to the budget. And this is the kind of effectiveness which deserves applause. Deputy head of Peter Poroshenko's party, Mr. Goncharenko, was live today. Thank you, Alexei. Now we have a question from our viewers. Good evening, my name is Mikhailo, I'm from Zaporizhia region. During the summer of 2014, while you serve as general prosecutor, the government of Yatsenyuk made a purchase contract to buy South African coal for our power plants. And in the fall of the same year, you have opened a criminal case concerning the fact that this type of coal doesn't fit to our type of power plants, and it doesn't ignite properly. But the director of one of those power plants, Petro Kravets, has stated and confirmed that this type of coal does ignite in our power plants. By doing so, you have created a corruptional scheme, and in my opinion, you have committed a crime through this, as you were right at the roots of the whole thing and could have done better. First of all, let us not override the court's decision in this case, and we all know that decision. We have heard you, Mikhailo, and now allow Mr. Yarema to answer you. Thank you very much for your question. I do remember this case well. This matter was widely discussed and well spread by the media. We are talking about what used to be called Parivsky Vugilia. You all remember that time when our power plants had a shortage and needed to be supplied with the proper type of coal. The only available type we had was the Ukrainian one, the one that melts instead of getting ignite. Truly, we have conducted the expertise and investigated this criminal case. The cost of this coal had exceeded the purchase price. The coal was being delivered to the state power plants of Center Energo. There are two of those plants, one in Kharkiv and another one in Kiev's oblast. For the fact, we have conducted the expertise and discovered that there was an abuse. We have declared a suspect of embezzlement of public funds to those who were involved. All of that has consisted with my resignation, and I don't really know the future of those criminal cases. Have you ever tried to find out? Well, I can only approach this as an average citizen, but I'm certainly not able to influence the investigation of this case in any way. I would say you are the journalist, and it's rather your function to investigate these kind of things. What is the average citizen Vitaliy Yarema is doing now, then? I'm engaged in legal activities. Do you teach? No, I offer commercial services. Does the current general prosecutor has ever approached you regarding your counsel and services? In what form? Yuri Vitalyevich and myself are friends, and I hope he feels the same way. We were together at Maidan. I've also offered my support to him when he was illegally imprisoned. I'm considering him being a patriot of Ukraine. I have a huge respect for him. We do meet occasionally and communicate, and there's nothing wrong with it. Yes, obviously. And that's why I'm asking if he has ever turned over to you as a friend for an advice. When he was getting appointed to this post, we had a meeting. Then, within my authority and overview of the situation, bearing in mind that there was a general prosecutor, Mr. Shokin, for quite some time between us, so I have briefed him on the general situation in general prosecutor's office, staff matters concerning those people who do the job well, and I think he has considered my advice. Do you have any political ambitions? Perhaps make a return back to the Rada? I've stood on Maidan together with my son, my brother, and my friends from Pereyaslav Khmelnytsky in 2014. We haven't thought of any political ambitions. Our only concern was about Ukraine and how to get things changed. As for now, if I would be able to influence the current ongoing processes, using my great experience in the law enforcement matters and my capabilities, I would definitely benefit the country. In what hypostasis, on what position, that is all up to God. Are you a member of any political party? No, I've only been a part of a communist party from 1982 through 1991. As we are having a cross interrogation today, I'm not quite sure who is a good cop here. Anyway, here's what I want to ask you. Viktor Grigorievich, you have said that between you and Mr. Lutsenko was another general prosecutor, Mr. Shokin. How do you evaluate his recent attempt to resume to the post of general prosecutor on the basis of his wrongful dismissal from this position? What is your take on that from the legal perspective? Well, all of this is a personal business of Mr. Shokin, and if he desires to resume back to the post, as well as he considers his resignation to be wrongful, then it is up to him. I know for the fact that Mr. Shokin has resigned personally, but all of that has been initiated by Mr. Biden. So what do we have? Mr. Biden has initiated the resignation of the General Prosecutor of Ukraine, which is a political persecution.
This is what I understood, but I haven't heard Mr. Shokin personally say any of that. We don't really communicate often, and I don't know his motivation under the attempt to resume back to the post. Svetlana, please, let's keep the party. This is my turn to ask a question, and it seems the role of the good cop is mine today. Okay, we're going to continue with questions from our viewers in a second, but first, let me ask you a question. Vitaliy Grigorovich, since we have discussed a little bit of Mr. Shocking, how would you comment on the story with the murder attempt and the thermovision? How would you evaluate this as a professional? You have worked both in General Prosecutor's Office and the Ministry of Internal Affairs. So what is the story with the thermovision? Well, in this case, we can judge the situation only based on if the crime has been solved. What is the definition of crime? Crime has four components: object, subject, objective, and subjective side. When the arrested individual is a suspect, the subjective side of the crime appears. On what basis? What was the motive? His mental attitude to the offense. Well, in this case, the subject has not been arrested. Circumstances have not been established. I personally haven't participated in an investigation, but rather read the commentaries of the former general prosecutor, the military prosecutor on it, and you probably did the same. So I can only recall on those commentaries, which I see no reason to repeat today. Well, okay, thank you.
0820-50-20, это для наших телезрителей. Также хочу обратить внимание, если вдруг Виктор Николаевич Шокин, вы нас смотрите, пожалуйста, ответьте.
Let me remind you, the law enforcement departments of Ukraine have been conducting over 400 searches and house checks in 15 regions of Ukraine, mainly targeting tax officers. This was a huge, simultaneous, anti-corruptional special operation. Those who were detained were transported by helicopters to Kiev. Vitaliy Grigorovich, how would you evaluate these special operations? Opinion has been divided about it. Some say well done, others, it's all good, too much noise, but looks like a show, because the operation was done few days prior to the General Prosecutor's report to the Rada. Well, let's sort all those facts into categories: emotional, juridical, and demonstrative. In 2014, Ukrainian prisons contained over 88,000 convicted persons. As for today, this number is little over 66,000. Yet up till this day, the crime rate has grown tremendously. I know it for the fact, as I am in constant contact with the law enforcement professionals. So with the increase in crime, the number of convicted persons has decreased. As for the special operation, let's wait for the court sentences. We should judge upon the court sentences rather than by the detention facts. As for the facts to the number of detentions of the operation, I can only envy to Mr. Lutsenko, because in 2014 I haven't had such an interaction with the Ministry of Internal Affairs and SBU. Unfortunately, in those days, we had cases such as with the Berkut company commander, Mr. Sadovnik. He was the one who organized executions on Maidan. So during his trial in the court, the operative staff of Berkut, dressed as civilians, upon their arrival to the court, have pushed all of the victims' relatives off the court hall. So I've immediately sent a letter out to Mr. Avakov in order to initiate an official investigation and to present those Berkut staff for the trial. But instead, I've received rather a formal answer with no following actions. Same counts for SBU and Mr. Nalyvaichenko. We've never had a normal contact. Why do you think there is a competition among agencies? I'm not really ready to talk about it, because it was simply an inner motivation of the agency heads at that time. This question should have been redirected to them. My conscience is clean. I've done all in my power to comply with the law, and I've tried to do it most effectively using my wide experience and professional capacities. Why did it all happen the way it happened? Well, let the history be our judge. Perhaps journalists should get involved and try to get some answer for these questions. However, today was a brilliant operation, and I can only applaud to the law enforcement bodies. As far as I know, the 30 million bail has been determined for each of those who were detained. I'm sure it's not a PR company, but those who are guilty will be brought to the justice.
Why do you think this date has been picked for the operation? The very date of the General Prosecutor report to the Rada. Do you think it is a coincidence? Let me remind you that the General Prosecutor doesn't have to report to anyone. There is no such function nor the law. But let me tell you, there were dozens, if not hundreds, of searches and house checks today done. All of those searches were sanctioned by the judges, and those sanctions were received much earlier, as far as I know. According to the operative information, sanctions were given prior to the operation, and I'm not ready to comment on the fact if all of that has been done to PR, General Prosecutor, in his report. And even more, the operation was done by the Ministry of Internal Affairs, Economic Crimes Department, under the procedural leadership of the General Prosecutor's Office, including Military Prosecutor's Office. So honestly, I'm not ready to answer exactly, but I think this is not the case. Well, the report of the General Prosecutor to the Rada has been announced a week prior to this event, so even Minister of Internal Affairs Mr. Vakov mentioned that. Obviously, it speaks a lot about such a good interaction between agencies. Well, as an operative professional, allow me to explain what is the crime and how to solve the crime. Among the operatives, we have a saying, the crime is like a fruit. It can be picked only when it's ripe. The proof system crashes when the crime is picked unripe. It can be picked post-ripe either. As the criminals may run away, it has to be picked at the right time. This is the axiom of a professional and investigative work. So I hope what we've seen today has been picked ripe and this whole gang going to be in prison. Well, the interesting fact, when the fruits are not ripe enough, you can throw them into the fridge. So the cold and darkness gonna do the rest. Maybe it's going to be true in this case. Anyway, we all joke around here. Back to you, Vasily. I got a personal question to you concerning the competition among agencies. Were there any occasions of any agency spying after one another? Well, let's say you have discovered a bug under your seat or something. No, I haven't found any of this, but I've had a pretty serious confrontation once. One prosecutor of the Dnipropetrovsk region has been beaten up severely, so I've appealed to the heads of law enforcement structures for help. Prosecutor's office doesn't have a special unit to protect its staff, so there is no protection from, let's say, an armed group of people in a uniform who suddenly broke into one of our offices, and with the grounds for this armed group to break into the prosecutor's office were open in certain criminal cases and certain lawful demands from the directorship of Metal Steel, directorship of Pavlograd Chemical Factory, directorship of Dnipropetrovsk Railcar Repair Plant. The group was led by Mr. Korban. They have arrived, broke into the prosecutor's office, tearing off his shoulders board, and demanded money for ATO and something else. As a result, I've opened criminal investigation, but other law enforcement structures showed no response to this. Then I've had an appeal to the president, explaining to him that this shouldn't be happening in our country. Every law enforcement agency should work cooperatively as one fist, fighting with the crime. As for today, the situation has improved and everything works in unison. Thank you. You are welcome.
Де існують правоохоронні органи, ми повинні діяти як одне ціле і одним кулаком знищувати злочинність і боротися зі злочинністю. Але зараз я бачу, що ситуація налагодилась і все йде в унісон.
Спасибо большое.
Будь ласка.
Продолжим.
We've just heard commentaries of the Deputy Minister of the Temporarily Occupied Territories, Mr. Grimchuk, on why did the President Poroshenko suggested to issue all type of passports to the residents of the occupied territories. It's pretty simple. The new biopassport holders qualify for the visa-liberating regime with the European Union. If you're the holder of an old Ukrainian type of travel passport, you gotta have a visa first. What do you think? Why did the president voice it today? Well, because these people live on the occupied territories and perhaps not able to receive the new biopassport. That's why we're seeing the return of an old type of passports for these categories of people. You know, in 2014, when the territories of Crimea and eastern Ukraine were being seized by Russia, there were quite high-level collaborationism among the local population. Mr. Turchinev, in one of his articles, stated that in 2014, in Crimea, up to 70% of the former Ukrainian military personnel and up to 90% of the law enforcement sided with the invaders. And what has been done today was done as an illustration to all of those people. And I'm pretty sure already those people have been disappointed with the occupation authorities. And we have to indicate that the Ukraine is a democratic country and they can travel from this country to the whole world. They can get visas, and therefore the president's move was absolutely logical. It was wise and fair move for all of those who live on occupied territories. Another question came from our Facebook page. Our viewer Alexander Dolotov asks a particular question. Was there any investigation carried out of the killings of the security forces on Maidan? Parallel investigation carried out in the framework of criminal proceeding of investigation by the Department of Investigation of the General Prosecutor's Office, including the investigation of the killings of the security forces. Despite of the fact that there was an amnesty given to those who were involved in an assault activities from the protesters' side, the appropriate criminal proceedings are under the investigation by Sergei Gorbatyuk, the head of the Department of Investigation, as the fact of the killings does not fall under the provided amnesty. Let's check if we have any more calls with the questions. Good evening. Petro Shishko from Vinnytsia region. I'm a former employee of the Internal Security. I've also worked as a deputy of a regional prosecutor 3 years ago. As a result of a new law on lustration, I've been fired. I consider it to be unjust and would like to hear your opinion on this. I've shared my opinion many times on this. I do consider the law on lustration to be unjust and anti-constitutional, because the person has to be held personally responsible for what he has committed, and this is the principle of individual responsibility, presumption of innocence. The law on lustration provided to dismiss those who were in the wrong time and the wrong place. I personally consider this law to be unjust. According to this law, I had to sign the dismissal of a large number of professionals who could potentially greatly benefit our country. What is the state of the General Prosecutor's Office now, if you're going to evaluate it as an outsider? Once again, I cannot do it. But I know that during my service as the General Prosecutor, the new law on Prosecutor's Office has been adopted. And today, during the General Prosecutor Yuri Lutsenko, this law is being implemented. There was a large reduction of staff which caused harm, particularly in the sphere of investigation of the criminal proceedings. For example, the procedural chief in the criminal proceeding has more than 1,000 proceedings. He is not able to read the headlines of these criminal proceedings in a week. I'm not saying even to get a grasp on it and investigate. 6,000 people fell into the staff reduction. It was rather a groundless and thoughtless decision. It should have been done together with the changes to the criminal and procedural code. My personal opinion as a jurist that today such institution as procedural authorities doesn't have its place in the criminal proceeding. The responsibility of supervising of the compliance of the law during the investigation and operational activities should be turned back to the investigators as it used to be before, to allow the investigator to make decisions as it used to be before. Today, the investigator's position, the investigator's activity in the criminal proceedings, unfortunately, has been leveled. All depends today on the procedural chief. That's why we're making General Prosecutor responsible for the pickpocketing, crime rate in the country, and etc. This is the area of responsibility of the Ministry of Internal Affairs and not the General Prosecutor. The General Prosecutor's responsibilities are human rights violation, violation of the law. When I served as a General Prosecutor, we've detected a massive abuse in the penitentiary system. where the heads of the prisons abused the prisoners. So we had to carry out arrests right there, in particular in Zhovtivori, Dnipropetrovsk region. I still remember this. But as for today, absolutely no one is overseeing this sphere. The Ombudsman office is absolutely unable to deal with such huge load. Our time is running out. As I've watched a short video of altercation between the leader of the radical party Oleg Lashko and the general prosecutor, a short question. You're not in the politics now. Your business is to provide legal services. Please tell us, in your opinion, what's more important for the general prosecutor, to have the professional education or the sense of humor? In the light of this, I have a question to Yuri Vitalyevich Lutsenko. Let no offense, but I'm going to ask him publicly. Let the whole country hear this. For about a year ago, People's Deputy Moiseichuk was taking bribes on a live video, explaining the bribes rates in the Rada. So my question is, why he's not in prison yet? This is my only question. Because this bribery was filmed while everyone was watching, this is such a shame. How come this People's Deputy criticizes the general prosecutor today instead of serving a sentence in prison? But as for the circus in the Rada, there is nothing new, and I don't really want to comment on that. Well, the kind of circus played from both sides. Well, today was a big night with Vitaliy Yarema. Thank you very much.